Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to Dissemination Day episode 14, where we're going to be talking about a really, really important paper, this one here, which is the definition and scope for PBS by Gore et al. In 2013. I started working in PBS sort of departments or teams in, I think it was 2012 or maybe 2013. So I feel like this paper has been about the entirety of my professional life. So if you are not familiar with it, then I'm delighted for you that you've got this opportunity to become familiar with it, because it's just really a foundational paper in PBS. So the authors of this paper are many and are like celebrities, hence my little picture here, of within the PBS world. So there's obviously Nick Gore himself, Peter McGill, Sandy Toogood, Dave Allen, Carl Hughes, Peter Baker, Richard Hastings, Stephen Noon, and Louise Den. So if you haven't encountered the papers or the works of any of these academics, or you come across an opportunity maybe to hear them speak at a webinar or to go to one of their conferences, then I would most definitely encourage you to jump on that opportunity. So we're kind of on a definition theme. Obviously, Hannah last Dissemination Day, I think, did she do the Kincaid paper maybe? And I just felt like this was a natural kind of follow-on from that. So the purpose of this article, obviously, from the authors, this is their words, was to provide a refreshed definition and scope for PBS, as well as to outline a framework for the delivery of PBS that is of practical value to a number of stakeholders. And the kind of context for this paper was there had been a number of guidance documents produced, which I'll touch on in a second. There had obviously also been the Winterbourne View, and off of the back of that, you know, the Department of Health papers and things started to mention PBS, and I think it became a really important thing that we developed a shared definition. And this wasn't the first definition for sure, but an up-to-date and shared definition of what it is that we're actually talking about. And this is still a process that is kind of ongoing. Some of the existing literature that they mention particularly when they are drawing on the making this definition and on the what ultimately becomes their 10 key components, which I think everybody should be pretty familiar with for the most part. They looked both at academic papers, so they looked at systematic and meta-analytic reviews of single case and small group studies that demonstrated how PBS had been used to significantly reduce problem behaviour, in most cases more than 50%. They specifically referenced one of the earlier Hasiotis paper, one from 2009. So that's not the most recent one, which has been receiving a lot of attention, maybe 2019, I think that was. My memory's not great for these things. But the original Hasiotis paper, which demonstrated that PBS could result in reductions of problem behaviour up to 43%. And they also looked at some of the more general guidance on supporting individuals who have difficulties with problem behaviour. And there's guidance from the British Psychological Society. There was the 2007 Mansell paper, and there was another publication on psychological interventions, clinical practice guidelines. So there's quite a lot, obviously, that was already out there at the time that they wrote this paper, and then they've drawn on all of those things to come together with what they have described as their definition, and then their multi-component framework, so their 10 key components. So on page 2 of their publication, which is page 15 of the overall within the journal, they describe their overall definition of PBS, and I have put this on a slide here for you to have a look at. They start, of course, with the key point that PBS is a multi-component framework, and then they have put some references there that would be helpful for you if anybody wanted to look at those. Then they make the point that PBS is about developing an understanding of challenging behaviour displayed by an individual based on an assessment of the social and physical environment and broader context within which it occurs. And this is, I think, a really important point about problem behaviour. We're not attributing the causation of problem behaviour entirely to an individual, but we're looking at that relationship between the individual and the context that they are in, that results in a particular set of circumstances or a particular behaviour. Secondly, they're looking at inclusion of stakeholder perspectives and involvement, and this is just huge. And it can be a really difficult thing for people to understand how to do. How do I, what does that mean, stakeholder involvement? What does it mean in terms of working with people who are nonverbal? How do I go about that? How do I include families when they maybe don't want to be involved? To what extent can I really make this happen? And that's obviously going to depend on the individual circumstances. We have worked with individuals before who were more than capable of choosing their preferred approach. There was a lady that we worked with who we quite genuinely showed her two different options of potential interventions that might target the problem behaviour, and she told us which one she liked better, and we used that one. If you are not able to engage with the individual to a meaningful extent, or maybe it would be too overwhelming or too distressing for them to have those conversations, then you do need to make the effort to seek the input of the key people in their lives and make sure that we are building strategies that are compatible and appropriate for the people that we are working with. The point C refers to the fact that we need to develop and implement and evaluate the effectiveness of a personalised and enduring system of support based on the functional assessment and the stakeholder perspectives. And point D is the all-important point that PBS should be enhancing quality of life outcomes for the focal person and other stakeholders. PBS is not, and I'm sure most of us know this, absolutely not a treatment for problem behaviour. That's not how we should be defining it at all. PBS is a model through which we can support people better from a behaviour analytic perspective. It's a model through which we can improve people's lives, and part of that might be targeting behaviours that are currently a barrier to the most enhanced quality of life that they could have. So the second part that they go on to talk about, they specifically define what they refer to as scope for PBS, which is essentially the settings in which it might be typically used. They talk about, I like the fact that they address this, because I do think there's a misconception that PBS is either something that happens in adult services, or in America it's something that happens in schools, or PBS is that bit we do before our physical intervention training, and actually none of those things are exclusively the case. So PBS can occur, either you could have you can have case-by-case basis, so you have a single practitioner that's entirely responsible for the process. PBS can occur if there's a team of practitioners who are all working together and they're all responsible for different elements. Alternatively, PBS can be implemented across an organisation, an organisational-wide context, where there's maybe a tiered system for referrals and for different kind of levels of specialist support as and when required. It can be in residential or small group homes, schools, family homes or community settings, any of the above. And the last part, which I again really love, is that PBS is for sure most well known when working with adults, children or young people with intellectual difficulties, but it's also incredibly, there's a great research base for it with individuals who have emotional or behavioural difficulties, or even other neurological conditions such as acquired brain injury. They then move on, after they have defined these bits, which I think are just really nice definitions. They then move on to outline their 10 key components, and this really is where the money kind of lies in this paper. And again, it's always kind of been there throughout my professional life, so I'd be interested to know, if it revolutionised anyone's working way of working, if they were already a PBS practitioner and then the 10 key components came out, and all of a sudden it was like, right, that really changes my perspective for how I should be working. But my suspicion is that for most of you, this will be really in keeping with the way that you're already operating, or at least I hope so. So the 10 key components are presented on a little table for you here, and they are split into 3 categories, the first of which is values, the second of which is theory and evidence base, and the last of which is process. So we talk a lot about values and the kind of the kind of unconditional positive regard that we bring towards the people that we work with, and the focus on quality of life, and the focus on improving people's lives through skills teaching and stakeholder participation. But what's the point of the 10 key components, and the point of all of this is that alone, or sometimes what people people joke about PBS just being kind of large scale, being nice to people, which is not, it's important to be nice to people, but that's not what PBS is at all. What I love about the 10 key components is that they really make the point that if these 10 key components aren't all being addressed, not necessarily, like, you don't have to sit down and make sure, like, that's how I'm addressing part 1, that's how I'm addressing part 2. But if you're looking at your process and it doesn't meet all of these components, then they are quite clear you are not doing PBS. Unfortunately, if I was to go through each of these 10 key components in excruciating detail, which I would love to do because I love to talk, we would be here for hours. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to touch on each of them like super lightly. However, if you are unsure about any of them, the paper has a little section on each of them with associated references for each of the section. So you can absolutely go and find that bit and then do some further reading that will hopefully help your understanding. The first key component is the prevention and reduction of challenging behaviour occurs within the context of increased quality of life, inclusion, participation, and the defence and support of valued social roles. So this is just so important, and my probably my takeaway from all of this when I'm working with services is we are focusing on quality of life. That is what we are focusing on. PBS is not about reducing service costs as such. It's not about, my staff don't deserve to get hit, although I agree with that. PBS is about improving people's lives, and that is just beyond important. The second component in values is that constructional approaches to intervention are used to design, to build stakeholder skills and opportunities and eschew aversive and restrictive practices. It is behaviourally possible to just eliminate a behaviour. That is in theory something we could do. If somebody's self-injuring, yeah, for sure we could just get rid of that. But it doesn't ask the question, why are they self-injuring? What is the missing skill? If they're self-injuring because they're in pain, do they need the skill to say, I'm in pain, please help me? And that should always be the first question. So when you're working with services or when I'm delivering training to people, usually I talk about, when you see a problem behaviour, the first question you should be asking yourself is, what is the skill that is missing? And that is where this component 2 fits in, because PBS by definition should be constructional and there should be a focus on skills building. Component 3 is about stakeholder participation, which I've already kind of touched on, but their voice should be heard in every single part of this, whether they're family members, whether they're friends, whether they're, the staff members that know them particularly well, and most importantly, of course, the person themselves. And their opinions should influence everything that we're doing and the way that we're working, and our process should be individualized to take all of that into account. Component 4 is the first in the second grouping of components, so theory and evidence base, and this is going to be familiar to many of you, and it is the part that really grounds PBS in the science. So component 4 is an understanding that challenging behaviour deserves to serve important functions for people. Behaviour has a purpose. It does not occur in a vacuum. And by understanding what that purpose is, we can really seek to support the person to find a better way. The goal is not tell them they can't have things. That's not the goal. The goal is find a way so that they can have those things without harming themselves, without harming their quality of life, and without reducing the likelihood that they can be fully included in their community. If you aren't sure about these individual functions, then that's not the purpose of this dissemination day, but there are just hundreds and hundreds of videos on YouTube that you can go and look at. Alternatively, you could look at some of the online training. Component 5, theory and evidence base again, is the primary use of applied behaviour analysis to assess and support behaviour change. I am probably going to just make a point here. I have had a couple of people contact me and say, what's the difference between PBS and ABA? And I'm not going to go into this hugely here because people get really hung up on a lot of these points. That's the wrong question. Is what is the difference between PBS and ABA implies they're different things. ABA is part of PBS, and that it couldn't be more clear than is made so in this paper. I have had people contact me saying, we don't do ABA, but we do PBS. If you are saying things like that, then it just suggests that actually you're not doing PBS, because obviously PBS is one of the 10 key components, and if you're not doing ABA, then you're not doing all 10 key components and you're not doing PBS. I'm just going to add a wee addendum there to say that what I'm not suggesting there is, if you're not using ABA but you're still focusing on quality of life and you're still, talking about social role valorization and you're still doing stakeholder participation, then what you are doing is probably great. I'm not suggesting that you should stop doing those things, but it is not by definition PBS, so that's not what whatever you're doing should be called. Component 6, again, still in theory and evidence-based, is the secondary use of other complementary evidence-based practices to support behaviour change at multiple levels of a system. And again, this is super important. There have, unfortunately, in my opinion, behaviour analysts and sometimes PBS practitioners have developed a bit of a reputation in some places, in specific places, for not playing that well with others. And I think that this is a problem, because actually PBS is done best when we work with other people to make sure that it's part of a truly integrated approach. PBS UK has associate speech and language therapists. We have associate occupational therapists. We've consulted psychologists and psychiatrists as and when the need requires. The suggestion that PBS in isolation will be enough for everyone is not the case. PBS is not the be-all and end-all of everything. It can, however, make radical differences to people's lives, especially when it is used as part of an overall therapeutic approach that includes the important other health professionals or psychological professionals or social professionals in that person's life. Component 7 is the first in process, and we're talking here about a data-driven approach to decision-making at every stage. And this means that we are looking at facts, not opinion. Data is so incredibly important, and sometimes you really cannot assess behaviour change in any direction unless you're looking at hard data, because the way that we feel about the situation or the different days on which we've perceived things, might be different from other people, and it's just too subjective. PBS absolutely our decisions must be made objectively, and therefore a data-driven decision-making process is just so key to the science as a whole. Component 8 is functional assessment, is used to form function-based interventions. And again, I'm not going to talk about this here because you most likely know what this is. And if you don't, then that's a whole other presentation on its own, along with some training and e-learning and all sorts of things. So I would encourage you to reach out if you don't know what that is. Component 9 for process is multi-component interventions to change behaviour proactively and manage behaviour reactively. If you only have a reactive plan, it's not PBS. That, by definition, is not PBS. And to be honest with you, if the majority of your plan is reactive, then I would argue that is not PBS. There isn't really, I don't think, I might be wrong, someone will correct me, I don't think there's a textbook rule about this, but the vast majority of what we do should be done before there are even any signals of problem behaviour. The vast majority of what we do should be done in this green stage here, which we refer to as proactive strategies, which means we're talking about skills teaching, we're talking about enhancing quality of life, we're talking about building rapport, we're talking about the potentially enhancing or nourishing the environment around the individuals. And finally, component 10 in process is that PBS is not a quick fix. It is not something that we do when there's a problem and stop doing when there is not. That does not make sense. PBS is implemented over a long period of time, and that's when it is done most successfully. We quite recently, PBS UK, we did an audit of the projects that we were involved in, and we looked at the differences between those projects that had been really successful and those projects that had been maybe a bit less successful, or we just felt like, didn't give us the buzz that the other ones had. And one of the things that came out really clearly in our successful projects was that not only did our values match the values of the person we were working with, or the commissioning agent, but they had committed to a long-term approach. And that is absolutely and undeniably key. So I have just thrown you through those 10 key components, and you probably have a million questions if you're not familiar with this paper. Build do a beautiful little video that's available on their website, and I will link it somewhere here, which goes through those 10 key components, and to be honest, they do a better job of it than I do. They maybe don't focus on some of the concerns the way that I did, but it's a really nice summary video if you want to show anybody. And the last thing I want to do just quickly is there are a couple of quotes from this paper that every time I go back and read it, I think, oh yes, no, that, and I end up highlighting it again. So I probably have half a dozen copies of this that are all highlighted in the same places. The first of these is talking about something we've been shouting about for ages, which is a kind of movement I keep referring to. I keep saying I'm going to start a movement called Burn the PBS Plan. And what they say here is, while the outlook in PBS is inherently optimistic, it is worth noting that a plan is just a document consisting mainly of words on paper and perhaps ideas in people's minds. A plan is not an end in itself, rather it is a device to guide implementation of what is usually a complex intervention. And this is it just couldn't be more true. If, as a PBS practitioner, you are spending disproportionate amounts of your time writing plans for people and they never get implemented, then I know how that feels. I know how frustrating it can be. I know how disempowering it can be. And the reality is, you're not doing PBS. You're being hired to do a job that you're not then being facilitated to do. Since setting up PBS UK, we have really focused on only writing long and detailed plans if the set of circumstances absolutely calls for it. Our time is far more effectively used supporting staff teams directly, doing competency-based training, figuring out which systems and processes or interventions are going to be the most successful. And then afterwards, if we have to write them up, we'll write them up. But a PBS plan is not a magic wand and it won't create change on its own. And I do think that is absolutely just so key in the work that we do. The second quote that I love is on a slightly different topic, but I have been banging on about throughout this whole dissemination day. From this standpoint, we argue that services practitioners or trainers that are unable to implement one or more of these elements, be it the use of ABA, stakeholder participation, or the development of multi-component frameworks, interventions, are by definition not operating within a PBS framework. And this is a hard and cold truth. There are a lot of services, and we're not here to name names, that's not what it's about, but we have gone to support who have told us they are already doing PBS. And when we get there, it's just, it's not true. And it's not that they're trying to be sly or deceitful, it's that they think they're doing PBS because people actually don't understand, or at least the key people haven't understood the entirety of what's involved with positive behaviour support. They equate positive behaviour support to every person in that service has something that is called a PBS plan, and it has been reviewed within the time frame that we are required to review it in, and therefore we can check that it's up to date. That is just so far from PBS that it's not even real. There's, amongst the PBS community, we sometimes refer to what we call as PBS Lite, which is, they receive PBS training, all the staff receive PBS training. Again, that would not be enough to satisfy the need for, to satisfy the requirement for being defined as positive behaviour support. If you're not clear on what I'm talking about here, there are some amazing resources out there. I have linked some of them for you here. The PBS Academy webpage has so many resources, including the PBS Competency Framework, but also the PBS Academy Standards for Services, Training and Practitioners, which outline in incredible detail what they reckon the requirements and the competencies and the levels of qualification or specialism should be for each of these, for each of the tiers of complexity. They are quite lengthy documents, but they're so worth the time, and maybe we'll do a dissemination day on one or other of them at some point. But we did summarise the PBS Academy Standards for Services. A commissioner had requested that we do that at one point, so I do have a summary, a 2-page summary, if anybody wants to see that. It talks about what points your training should be covering and what kind of standards it needs to meet to be defined as good PBS training. And finally, if you are hiring or you have PBS practitioners, it talks about what their competencies should be, what their qualifications should be, and depending on which level they fit into, what their remit should look like. I think that's just really important. I mean, it's hard to meet. It's going to be for a lot of services, really hard to meet because those standards are ambitious, but they're also important to make sure that PBS is done right. The other reference I have put here for you is just another definition paper that isn't actually a paper yet, at least I don't think it is, I'll be in trouble if not, by Dr. Anne MacDonald of Glasgow University, and she talks about the 17 features of PBS. You can get a copy of that at this HTML here, at this URL, which is the Keys to Life PBS document, I think. I'm not entirely sure, but it includes lots of resources about what PBS is, and it includes obviously her 17 features, which you might find helpful. I would absolutely encourage you to go and read up on all of these components if you're unclear on any of them. There's so much training out there. Our own PBS, our own introductory training to PBS, our CPD accredited one, it just focuses on the 10 key components. That's how we deliver it. And I know that there are a lot of other professionals, like PBS professionals out there, who go about it the same way because it just provides that level of clarity. In the meantime, I hope you found that helpful and not in any way depressing. If you've kind of looked at that and been like, oh, I need to address my practice somewhat in some ways, that's great. You know, go forth and make sure that what you are doing is PBS by name and by nature and not just by name. And in the meantime, we will be back with another episode. We're not quite sure on what yet, but in a couple of weeks. So see you soon.